Hey, this is Joe from Personas, and today we're going to talk about mixing, specifically overmixing. Okay, here's the story. I was doing a mixing session recently, and it was a part of a live stream that I was doing for our Personas Sphere members. And the idea was to just walk through a mix, at least the first part of a mix, setting things up and getting a basic rough mix, and then we're going to continue working through this mix over the coming weeks and months. So one thing really struck me, and I wanted to point it out to you, especially if you're just getting started with mixing or if you're frustrated with the way your mixes sound. There's a good chance, if your mixes are not turning out the way you want them to, a couple of things are probably true. One, the tracks might not be that great, so let's work on making better sounding tracks. But two, the other issue that I see a lot lately is you might just be overmixing. What do I mean by overmixing? You might just be adding too much stuff to the mix. Too many plugins, too much effects, just too many plugins on an individual channel, too many plugins globally in the session. Now, there are times when you just need a lot of plugins to achieve a particular sound. I'm all for that. I've done that myself. I'm not saying that's bad or wrong, but I will say when you're learning how to do this and you're starting to get your sea legs, so to speak, you want to make sure to go easy on the plugins, because what happens is the track or tracks in question may not need much, if anything, in the way of EQ and compression. And you're just adding stuff because you think you should, but you don't really have a reason. And then B, you might not be very good with EQ and compression yet. So it makes sense, if I'm not very comfortable with EQ and compression, that I would use it sparingly and only in a few key places as I'm learning how to use it. So I like to treat mixing like that old game show, Name That Tune. And they would say, I forget exactly how it worked, but they would buzz in and say, I can name that tune in 6 notes. So for me, when I sit down to mix, I'm thinking, I can mix this song in 5 plugins. Not really, but that's the idea. How few things can I do to this track to make it sound amazing? Because oftentimes, in my experience over the years and in listening to hundreds of mixes from home studio folks all over the world, one common thread that I see is people sometimes go way too far. They typically, if their mixes are messed up, it's not because they didn't do enough, it's because they did too much. And it's just human nature, it happens. One of the things that you need to do is make sure you have a good balance. Are all the tracks in the right volumes? Or when you first listen to the tracks, are the drums super loud and your first inclination is to put a compressor on there to turn them down? What if instead of that, you just turned them down and got all those balances right, then started reaching for your plugins? So I want to play a little piece of audio for you, and I want you to guess, you can comment if you want, how many plugins you think there are on this session. Okay? Just a number. Pick a number. So I'm going to play coming into this chorus section where most of the tracks are playing. I'm going to start with no plugins and then turn all the plugins on. By the way, in case you didn't know this, at the top left-hand side of your mixer, I have the mixer closed right now, but when it's open, and even here in the arranger, you've got these buttons here. This is the one I'm using to turn all the inserts on and off. So plugins are called inserts in Studio One. I can activate all of them and turn them all off with one little click. So let's hit play. I'll start without plugins and then I'll turn them on. Here we go. Okay, what do you hear? Now, it's still a rough mix. I'm not here to say, look, it's finished. It's just, this was like the first rough mix that I did. And I only used, I believe the count was 8 plugins. And that's it. And let me show you how I organize those. I'm actually going to start by closing all these folders so that we only have our main folders here. Drums, bass, electrics, keys, vocals, and background vocals. That's our 6 main categories of sound. And if I switch over to the mixer, you can see I have 1 plugin on each of these. I actually didn't do anything on the keys bus, so that actually doesn't count towards our plugin count. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then I had 1 plugin on the lead guitar for a solo part. So that makes what, 7, and then Technically, I'm sending the vocal and the guitars to the spring reverb, slapback delay, and analog delay. These are a part of my default template. So what you were hearing in the before and after didn't really come from those. It came mainly from just these fat channels that I used on the individual channels. In fact, I didn't use them on the individual channels. What you'll notice is I only use them on the buses. So this gets back to that top-down mixing thing that I talk about sometimes, or a lot, where I try to say, how great can I make the drums sound by just putting something on the drum bus, and then work my way backwards from there. And that's been my approach to mixing. Started off as an idea just to do it quicker, and I ended up liking the sound better than starting from the kick and the snare and moving forward. So as an example, here are my drum tracks all in blue. Now, some of these are the drums, and then these are like percussion and other things, and some cymbal swells and things like that. But there's a lot of drum tracks here, but as you can see, all I've done to the individual tracks is panning and level, and then the only plugin I have on the entire drum kit is here, and I'm using the classic compressor, which comes, if you're a Sphere member, you get that included, and then the Vintage EQ, which comes with Studio One Pro. An Artist, I believe, and it's one of my favorite EQs. I use it all the time. But here's what the drums sound like without the plugin. So right out of the gate, it's a good drum sound. There's some samples in there mixed in with, I think, real recorded drums. Sounds fine. And now listen to what happens when I kick on this compressor, which has a fairly quick attack, but I'm not trying to compress too much so that the needle gets back down to 0 as much as possible. And then a little bit of EQ here, a little boost in the lows, cut at 360, a little boost up in the highs as well. Kind of typical smiley face EQ curve that can work well for drums. Listen to what it does just to the drums. Now, it's a little bit louder with the compression, and there will probably be a complaint about that. I could probably bring the output gain down a little bit, but this is one of those clicky knobs that just jumps from like 2 to 4 dB. I want it to feel roughly the same volume, if not a little bit louder, but really what I'm getting is a difference in tone entirely. Before, it just sounds like a raw drum kit. With just this one plugin, really with just this one compressor, the kick and snare now have that punch and snappiness that I'm looking for in a mixed drum kit. Now, you could do that by putting a compressor on the kick, putting a compressor on the snare, but there's something really special about getting that tone, or at least starting to get that tone on your mix bus by itself. Like I am been doing this for years and years and years, and every time I do this on a drum kit and I get it sounding really great, it always makes me excited because I'm thinking, how in the world? Like, my brain and the way I kind of grew up in audio was to put plugins on every channel, multiple plugins. Learn how to dial in that sound on that kick drum. Learn how to dial in that hi-hat mic. I'm not saying those things are wrong, but look what we can do with just basically an EQ and a compressor across a drum bus. It's fascinating. That snare is just going bam. Little rule of thumb trick I try to do. I try to make the needle bounce similarly with the kick and the snare. That may not work for all types of music, but for rock stuff, boom, ga, that's kind of what I'm going for. And it's not, we hit play, it's not a huge amount of compression, right? It's getting 2 to 3 dB of gain reduction because I want the needle to come back down between hits as much as it can. But it adds this mixed quality to it that wasn't there before. Now, this becomes, for me, it's kind of fun to think about the way I set up my session. Drums to the left, then bass, then guitars, then keys, then vocals, and background vocals. That's how I do it almost every time. This gets progressively less effective on different types of tracks. So on guitars, you can do a basic tone shaping on your guitar bus, but you're probably going to need to go in and EQ the different guitars differently, most likely. Background vocals, however, I treat them as just one track. Once I balance them, it's just to set up one plugin on all of them to get the tone that I want. So instead of thinking of this as 4 separate vocals I've got to EQ and compress, or 5 separate vocals, I really just treat it almost like a keyboard that I can just process with a single EQ and compressor like this. I don't always put the best foot in front of me. Now, without processing on that, As you can imagine, those are pretty thick with that kind of vocoder effect. It wouldn't really cut through the mix. I don't always put the best foot in front of me. So I cleaned it up a little bit, brightened it up a little bit with Fat Channel using a little bit of compression and a good amount of EQ to make it a little crispier sounding. I don't always put the best foot in front of me. Gosh, that's beautiful. And then that's going to cut through the mix a little bit better. I don't always put the best foot in front of me. Still needs some work. That breathy sound in the vocal needs to be taken care of. But you get the idea. We're suddenly going from a song that has 56 channels in it to really a song that has 6. Drums, bass, guitars, keys, vocals. That's 5. Guitars, bass, keys, drums. That's 6. And that to me, both in the way that I approach mixing, also and in a way of keeping myself from feeling overwhelmed by 1,000 tracks, it's really only 6. And I get the mini mix of the drums together, then I get the bigger mix of the drums with everything else, and I just keep kind of going back and forth between those two modes and end up with a good sounding mix. So I hope this has gotten you excited to mix. If you've never tried this approach, just try it. Maybe it doesn't work for you. Or maybe you hate the way it sounds by compressing just on the bus itself. It may not work for all styles of music. It may be too simplistic for certain styles and certain performances and certain recordings, but over the years of the stuff that I like to work on, it's worked really well. So I encourage you to give it a shot. You may find yourself mixing drums with just a handful of plugins instead of dozens like you were before. Thanks so much for watching. By the way, if you want to see stuff like this and more kind of behind the scenes, in-depth, longer training, consider becoming a Sphere member. You get Studio One Pro, you get Notion, our notation software, you get all the extra plugins, like all these extra different compressors that I use from time to time. With Studio One Pro, you get the first 3, but with Sphere, you get all of these, and there's some really cool sounds in there. In addition to live streams every month and custom longer form training content from myself, Gregor, and other friends of Presonus. Consider it. It's certainly not, you're not obligated. You can always just use Studio One the old-fashioned way, but if you want to come join us, we'll be there waiting for you. All right, that's it for me. Thanks for watching. See ya.